You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 27, Return to Avalon.
Size is the best determiner of a dragon's age. Some subscribe to counting the ridges on horns, but the myth that they lay down a single ridge per year, like rings on a tree, is absurd. That would mean the youngest of the high dragons is over 1,000 years old.
Everything on Avalon Island that could burn was burning, which was considerably less than one might think. Leaves shriveled and underbrush flared, but trees that ancient hadn't gotten that way without surviving a few fires. Some were guarded by snow, others swamp, some just by their enormity. Still, the island roared with fire, and the sky filled with smoke. Fires may be a natural part of the life of a forest, but it isn't gentle. Even the air high up on the butte was hazy and gray. Kuro prowled through the high school, silent as a mouse, slipping in and out of classrooms, peeking out windows, gathering information. The school was in good shape. Wisps of smoke drifted through the halls, but other than that, it seemed unharmed. It was a sturdy building, but no granite citadel or summer palace. It could not have survived unscathed by accident. The reason for its survival was made clear by a look out any window. In every direction were defensive walls of crystalline scales. Mere Pogo had coiled thrice around the whole school, protecting it from the antics of the males vying for her approval. They fought each other, delivered gifts of gold, and belched flame, all in hopes of earning her favor, not knowing it had already been stolen. Her children squawked and tussled with each other along her spines, playing at being adults, apparently unbothered by their mother's golden collar and strange stillness. Her huge head rested on her own flank outside the window of Merle's tower chamber. There, Merle stood on his balcony and watched with manic adoration, overcome with exultation at his prize. That was going to be a problem. The scales under which the Luton cocoon was hidden were being watched by a mad wizard. Maybe if Kuro knew exactly the right one, he could make a dash and do something. But there were dozens of the scales, each as big as a canoe and held firmly against her neck. That could be a sign that a part of her wasn't entirely dominated by the collar. When relaxed in her cave, those scales fanned out, giving her a spiny frill. Now they were pressed down so hard not a sheet of paper could slide underneath. In a way, that was good news. The cocoon was protected, safe from the machinations of Merle for the moment. He had time to think. Night was falling. Merle would have to sleep at some point, and with the cover of smoke and darkness, Kuro could make an attempt. He just had to hide and wait. The wizard did eventually sleep. Frustratingly, it was atop Mere Pogo's forehead. He lay on her, gripping her scales like a handbag in a crowd, as if some purse snatcher might grab her and run off, denying him his hard-won prize. It was ridiculous, of course. Nobody was going to run off with a dragon of geologic proportions. It was also annoyingly prescient. Kuro slipped from his hiding spot in the school, out onto the soft grass. In the screaming of the dragons above and the roaring of the fires below, he was more than silent. He approached with care, keeping out of sight, creeping through Mere Pogo's blind spots, becoming one with the shadows. One hand touched the dragon's sleeping form. She did not stir. Using her scales as handholds, he climbed. The sharp edges bit into his hands and sliced at the thinning soles of his shoes. His grip was shaky by the time he crested her shoulder and reached the back of her neck. He'd never tried to pick a pocket bigger than himself before, nor one that was attached to a dragon, and definitely not one containing a baby. He pondered and puzzled as he inspected the dozen or so massive scales that might contain Shingle's child. And then everything was ruined by his baking. Mere Pogo's daughter slammed down beside him and started chirping excitedly. She ran in circles and butted him with her snout, demanding more pies. He'd considered this possibility. Well, not this exact possibility, but at least the good chance that he wouldn't get it on the first try. He touched Mere Pogo and teleported away. At least he tried to. Instead of retreating to safety, he stayed in place and flickered. A very odd experience followed the pain and nausea, that of understanding. He knew why it hadn't worked. He could prove it mathematically. The years of schooling had actually sunk in. He was confident, given access to a couple of books and a lot of paper, he could work out the interweaving geometries of the magical fields and the thought pattern interference that prevented his departure. In brief, the giant enchanted collar around Mere Pogo's neck was imposing wizard thoughts on the dragon, confusing her natural magic. That was the sort of explanation one might give to a first-year junior high student. Given his extensive study, Kuro had a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of why he was probably about to die. He executed escape plan number 2. Pulling his umbrella from his bag, the wind pulled him up and over the rousing dragon and out into the night. Then, another force overpowered the wind, grabbed his umbrella and pulled him directly, abruptly, straight down into the ground. He bounced. For those who have never hit the ground with a bounce, consider this fair warning that it is not medically advisable. The west wind tried to push some of herself into his lungs because all of his breath had been knocked out. His umbrella was yanked free of his grip and soared across the high school lawns to the beckoning hand of Merle. The wizard appreciated the fine craftsmanship and runework of the umbrella he'd just snatched, while he was gently lowered to the ground on an outstretched hand of his captive dragon.
"Is that you lying there, Kuro?"
He sounded almost pleased.
"I didn't think you'd come back. Sorry for the rough treatment."
Kuro staggered to his feet and glared at Merle.
"Oh, don't become a sore loser, my boy," he said. "That's something I liked about you. You always took loss so well. It's an admirable trait, not one of my strengths if I'm honest."
Kuro was in about the worst position a thief could be, exposed on open ground, his paths to easy escape cut off, under the steady watch of a powerful wizard, and surrounded on all sides by fire and dragons. The last of those he hadn't worried much about in his earlier escapades and thievery. He supposed they weren't that dissimilar to guard dogs, if guard dogs were 100 times the size and ate intruders instead of barking at them.
"What did you think you were doing?"
Merle asked. Kuro answered only with a scowl. Anything else would be a transparent lie.
"Aiming for this, were you?"
Merle tapped on the thin, silvery circlet sitting snugly on his bald head. It had been there so long it had formed a groove in his skull.
"Gotten a bit bold after unmasking 2 of me brethren, eh?"
Kuro continued to not respond.
"I don't fault you for that, you know. In fact, I should thank you. They were overstepping, being too ostentatious, too impatient. I had nothing to do with the kidnapping of your friend. That old business was regrettable. And the fuss with the little Luton and Vincent, infiltrating my island without permission. I can understand why you think poorly of me. My fellows have treated you and yours quite badly. Coming to fight me with a sword I gifted you is a nice touch. I'll grant you points for style."
It seemed like Merle was telling the truth, but was no more convincing for it. He critiqued his copies like opponents in chess. It wasn't that he thought they were horrible villains who used people's lives like pieces in a game. He just thought their methods were too aggressive. He preferred a more subtle strategy.
"You're Claudius Roche?"
asked Kuro.
As much as any of us are, yeah, said Merle. I inherited the circle after that body died.
How many of you are there?
I don't know if you'll believe it, said Merle.
He rested the umbrella on his shoulder and gave it a little twirl.
Not too many, I don't think. No point in creating competition. We keep to ourselves mostly. Make another brother when a good opportunity presents itself, or move along when a body gets too weak. That's all.
There was absolutely no concern in Merle's manner. He kept his distance, but he had control of the board and he knew it. He was a wizard, a real wizard, in command of a lindworm and by extension her children. Kuro was entertainment rather than a threat.
So, you got your dragon. What now? Said Kuro, working to draw out the conversation, hoping some outcome other than disaster might present itself.
The reaction was not the extended villainous gloating about plans for world domination he'd hoped for. Instead, he got a look of confusion. The sort of look worn by someone who couldn't comprehend how stupid their conversation partner was. Unless Kuro was mistaken, which he thought he must be, this was the plan. Merle had won. He had the prize. The game was over. If anything, he'd wait for the board to reset so he could play another round. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a big male dragon. He breathed a huge stream of fire across the sky as a display of fitness for Merepogo, then dumped claws full of gold shingles torn from the roof of Wertheim before her.
"She's mine!"
Merle screamed, suddenly overcome with mad jealousy. His face twisted in almost inhuman rage, and he bared his teeth at the animal. At his direction, Merepogo swatted the poor dragon out of the air with her tail. It crumpled to the ground and limped away, wounded from the impact as well as the rejection. In that moment of irrational, uncontrollable rage, Kuro saw something that had been hidden behind the chess-playing, long-scheming wizard. Pieces fell into place, and he saw the puzzles he had failed to assemble, all connecting in the middle. A multi-dimensional crisscrossing of images, as twisted as the space along Detritus Lane, all became a single, clear shape when viewed from the right angle. It all fit together. The decades-long plans that didn't seem to have sensible goals. The habit of sitting at the top of tall towers. The collecting of treasures. The fanatical obsession with the dragon he'd just captured. The story the Norns had told him. The efforts to create a half-Luton servant. It all made a twisted kind of sense. Kuro started to laugh. In his hopeless situation, he found hilarity in finally finding answers, even if the answers would die with him that night. The wizard who had spied on the Norns and tried to dominate the mind of a dragon, the Norns said had just sat around on a pile of treasure and didn't know why. That wasn't the end of the story. He had a head full of dragon thoughts mixed with his wizard ones, and had seen how the Norns shared their minds. He didn't just roll over and die on the pile of treasure. He passed on his mind and his madness. He spent lifetimes competing with himself for territory and dominance, waiting for a female. The reason his plans didn't make sense to wizards is that they made sense only to dragons. They were plotting and planning and securing territory to do the only thing a dragon really cared about: winning a mate. Their total disregard for the life of humans? Natural. Why would something so big and great as a dragon care about a human being? Their creation of and odd affection for Kuro? Obvious. They wanted their own Luton.
"What's so funny?"
Merle demanded, his joviality stripped by being left out of a joke.
"You're a dragon," said Kuro.
He seemed to take offense at that.
"Don't compare me with those mindless beasts," he snarled. "I am the pinnacle of wizard kind, not some drooling reptile."
That's how she likes them, though. Large, ferocious, and stupid, Kuro teased. She told me.
"What are you talking about?"
The anger in his voice came from genuine ignorance. The giggles overtook Kuro. Merle didn't know. Of course he didn't. He'd never met a female dragon. He wanted one, desperately. But that was just inherited impulse. He had never seen one, didn't know they could talk, didn't really know anything about them more than his stolen instincts and wrong wizard books told him. She was just a prize to be won. Merle's patience ran out, and his anger overflowed at the mocking laughter. With a cruel sneer and a sharp gesture, his captured dragon stirred. She grunted, and her children attacked. The boys flocked and dove at Kuro in formation, ready to fight over his limbs like teenagers at a turkey dinner. This, Kuro had anticipated. This he had prepared for. He upended his bag. The wealth of Tirnanog poured forth. Mounds of treasure that had once filled the vault of the summer palace gushed out. The hatchling's desire for the paltry scraps of meat Kuro's body could offer were overwhelmed by their affection for gold. The whole flight diverted into the growing pile, splashing happily in the coins and fighting over their glitteriest items. Merle offered Kuro a nod, recognizing good gamesmanship. Not good enough for him to concede or withdraw, though. Another gesture brought the daughter soaring in at her mother's command. The girl wasn't distracted by gold like her foolish brothers. She was easily twice their size and more than twice as clever. Her serpentine body swam through the air like a snake in water. She dove in, landed, and squawked, demanding to be fed and nudging his satchel. Kuro tossed it away, and the girl gave chase. She shoved her whole head inside and gorged herself on the remaining pies within. Merle expressed a collection of conflicting emotions. He was at once confused, surprised, impressed, and furious that he'd been outmaneuvered by a move he didn't understand. He brought his queen into play. Mere Pogo lifted her enormous head. She settled beside her master, turned her empty eyes on Kuro, then exhaled an inferno. The lawns, gardens, hedges, and trees Merle had tended for so long were sacrificed in the blaze to wipe away the troublesome pest. Soil turned to ash, pavement to glass in the heat of her breath. Marie had once told Kuro that the royal armor had almost a mind of its own. It protected the wearer of the golden bracelets whether they wanted it or not. She'd found herself covered in its protective shell in defense of threats such as spilled tea and a dropped spoon. Kuro was grateful for it. He hadn't worked out how to turn it on voluntarily after he stole the cuffs off the ground where Marie had discarded them in the summer palace courtyard. She hadn't wanted them, after all. They were anyone's for the taking, so Kuro had claimed them before he left. The searing heat of the lindworm rolled around him, but from within the greatest armor ever crafted in the Three Kingdoms, it felt like a pleasant summer breeze. When the dragon's breath finally ran out, Kuro was standing unscathed among the cinders, resplendent in the golden armor. "Well done, my boy. Well done indeed." Merle looked upon him with a mix of respect and jealousy. He coveted that armor as the Roche in the palace had. It was all the things a dragon loved. Dominance, power, and gold, in a form that could make him more like the dragons he felt he should be. "But you make the same error as always. You play too defensively." Merle was right. Kuro had been on the defensive since the start, making moves just to survive, not thinking steps ahead. But the long fire bath had given him time to get his head straight, to find what he'd taken from Niflheim, and prepare to do wizardry. He extended his hand and cast the only spell he'd truly mastered in all his time at school. He hadn't cast it since his first year and had done everything he could to forget how, but those memories could never truly leave him. "Latir," he sang out, with all the sadness and despair he carried with him. Every lonely day and fearful night, every regret, the knowledge he was just a tiny, broken man in a world in which he could never belong. An ashy torrent flowed from Kuro's golden gauntlet, and Merle casually stepped to the side. "A fine effort, my boy," said the wizard.
but I am more than familiar with your capabilities. I've been keeping my eye on you for quite some time. If it is a wizard duel you want, let me show you how it's done."
Kuro drew Excalibur, a fruitless gesture. An untrained and incompetent wizard, even armed as finely as he, stood no chance against a master of the art. With hardly a word, Merle conjured a floating shield of light for himself and a rain of boulders for his opponent. Even if the armor came out unscathed, the battering would reduce its contents to pudding. Kuro dodged as best he could. The unfamiliar weight of the armor slowed him, so more than one rock clipped him as he ran away from Merle. He staggered as they bounced him around, preventing him from making steady progress in any direction. Clear that he would not escape the assault, he turned and squared himself up against his attacker. Gripping Excalibur with both hands, he leapt skyward with the aid of the armor's wings and his ever-present ally, the West Wind. Merle laughed at the disoriented boy. He was clumsy with the sword, incompetent in the armor, and much too far from Merle for the slash to be any threat. But Kuro was not aiming for Merle, nor his rain of rocks, nor his dragon. Chess is a game that takes a lifetime and some measure of genius to master. A beginner has no chance of winning against even a moderately experienced player. Which is why, for someone like Kuro, it is vitally important that his opponent not notice that they were actually playing 3-card Monty, and the queen they thought they had their eye on had been swapped for a deuce. Merle had never been a target of Kuro's spell. The motionless dragon beside him had soaked up Kuro's agony and despair, his sadness and misery. She'd gone limp. Tears streamed from her eyes, and, being exactly as big as she knew she was, she had shrunk. Her color hadn't known to shrink with her, so it fell, a Ferris wheel-sized ring toppling among Merle's meteor shower. Kuro's sword connected with the huge golden collar as it crashed down around him, slicing into it and its myriad overlapping enchantments. The resulting explosion sent him soaring, smashing into the diminished body of Merepogo. Merle's rage was incandescent. His prize had been stolen. Years, decades, centuries of waiting and planning ruined by a horrible child. The dragon in him roared. "She is mine!" he screamed. The Luton and Wizard and Crow both rebelled with one heart. She didn't belong to Merle. None of it did. She was his dragon. This was his school. It was his home, his family, his to care for, his to protect. "No," was all Kuro said. The armor melted back into its cuffs, and Kuro gave one last hateful look at Merle before laying a hand on his dragon. The maw of the void opened wide and swallowed hard. The nothingness between space was not accustomed to such a large meal. The passage was not gentle or pleasant. Kuro was wrung out like a rag, turned inside out, and spun out like cotton candy. Fluffs of himself became entangled in stars and interwoven with his passengers, before recollecting on the lint trap of reality and being crushed back into shape. They were expelled with the violence of a bad meal. Kuro, his dragon, his school, his baby nieces and nephews, both newborn and cocooned, and a good deal of Avalon Plateau crashed down on the hill outside the orphanage. Kuro felt Merepogo's mind, small and weak from the spell he'd cast on her, and miserable from the involuntary journey, touch his. "Please never do that again." Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.